Imagine a world where illness was considered divine punishment and healing a miracle. The Middle Ages, an era of contrasts, when medicine balanced between faith and nascent scientific knowledge. In cities, learned men in long robes studied the positions of the stars to make a diagnosis, while in villages, healers gathered herbs by the light of the full moon. University doctors, relying on the works of Hippocrates and Galen, explained diseases as an imbalance of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Treatment was often limited to diet and bloodletting, a practice as common as it was dangerous. Official medicine scorned surgery as a craft unworthy of an educated person. At the same time, in monasteries, monks carefully recopied ancient medical treatises and cultivated medicinal plants, creating the first apothecaries' gardens. It was in this contradictory world, where rational knowledge coexisted with a belief in miracles, that the foundations of modern medicine were laid. While common folk turned to healers and barbers, the elite of medieval society could afford the services of university physicians, educated men in long robes, fluent in Latin, and versed in ancient treatises. These scholarly medics considered themselves direct heirs of the great Galen, whose works, written as early as the 2nd century, remained an undisputed authority for 1,000 years. A university doctor rarely stooped to a physical examination of the patient. Touching a sick body was considered undignified for an educated person. Instead, he relied on 3 main diagnostic methods. The first was urine analysis. Urine was collected in special glass vessels, and the doctor carefully studied its color, smell, and even taste. The second method was pulse observation, which, according to Galen's teachings, could have dozens of different types, each indicating a specific imbalance of fluids. And finally, the most refined method was considered to be the creation of the patient's astrological chart. For in the medieval worldview, the human body was inextricably linked with the cosmos. The approach to treatment was based on the theory of 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. It was believed that health depended on their correct proportion, and illness arose from an imbalance. To restore equilibrium, diets based on opposing qualities were prescribed: hot or cold, dry or moist. If a patient was diagnosed with an excess of hot and moist blood, they were prescribed cold and dry food. Bloodletting was the most common procedure prescribed by scholarly doctors. They believed that by releasing blood, they freed the body from excess fluid and restored balance. However, they themselves rarely performed this procedure, entrusting it to barber surgeons, whom they considered mere craftsmen. Of particular interest are the prescriptions for medicines that university doctors wrote. These complex formulations could include dozens of ingredients, from local herbs to exotic substances brought from the East. Among the most expensive components were powdered precious stones and even gold, which, it was believed, possessed special healing power. Such medicines could only be afforded by the wealthiest patients. Scholarly medics looked down upon practical surgery, considering it an unworthy occupation for the intellectual elite. "Where there is blood, there is dirt," was a popular saying of the time. This aversion to practical interventions had tragic consequences. Surgery developed separately from theoretical medicine, in the hands of craftsmen without formal education. In the medieval world, there was a clear division between those who healed with words and those who worked with their hands. While learned doctors pondered the balance of humors, gazing at the stars, another category of healers dealt with the practical side of medicine: barber surgeons, whose signs with red and white striped poles can still be seen on the streets of European cities. A barber in the Middle Ages was a jack of all trades. He trimmed beards, extracted teeth, bled patients, set dislocations, and even performed complex operations. His social status was lower than that of a university physician. He was considered a craftsman, like a blacksmith or a shoemaker. However, it was these individuals with calloused hands and sharp tools who often proved to be the last hope for the suffering. The instruments of a barber surgeon are astonishing in their variety. Lancets for bloodletting, forceps for tooth extraction, saws for amputations, needles for stitching wounds. Many of these instruments were custom-made by local blacksmiths and passed down through generations. Some masters possessed special secrets for hardening metal, which made their tools particularly valuable. Bloodletting was the most common procedure performed by barbers. They made small incisions in the patient's veins with special lancets or used leeches. This procedure was believed to help with a multitude of ailments, from fever to melancholy. An experienced barber knew from which part of the body it was best to draw blood for a specific ailment, following a complex system of correspondences between organs and body parts. Anesthesia in medieval surgery left much to be desired. Barbers used opium, mandrake extract, or belladonna to dull the patient's pain. In extreme cases, alcohol was resorted to, or simply the physical strength of assistants holding the patient down. Some surgeons prided themselves on the speed of their operations. A limb amputation could take less than a minute, which was critically important in the absence of effective pain relief. Surprisingly, some barber surgeons intuitively understood the importance of cleanliness. They boiled instruments before use, rinsed wounds with wine or vinegar, which acted as a primitive antiseptic. These simple measures, based on practical experience rather than theoretical knowledge, saved patients' lives long before the discovery of microbes. In wartime, barber surgeons became indispensable. They followed armies, providing aid to the wounded directly on the battlefield. It was in field conditions that they perfected their skills in amputations, arrow removal, and the treatment of hacked wounds. Many innovations in surgery were born from the harsh necessity of saving soldiers' lives. Far from urban universities and monastic infirmaries, in the shadow of forests and on the outskirts of villages, lived people whose knowledge of the healing properties of plants was passed down by word of mouth, from mother to daughter, from father to son. Village healers and urban herbalists, a special caste of medieval healers whose methods combined generations of practical experience with mystical beliefs and rituals. In every village there was a local healer, a woman, usually elderly, who knew the secrets of herbs and natural remedies. Her secluded house was surrounded by a garden with dozens of medicinal plants. Here grew chamomile for stomach aches, mint for headaches, sage for throat inflammations, St. John's wort, the herb for 99 ailments. Many of these plants indeed contained active substances whose efficacy has been confirmed by modern science. Healers knew how to prepare ointments for wound healing from calendula and propolis, decoctions from willow bark containing aspirin-like substances, garlic infusions with powerful antibacterial properties. For colds, they used diaphoretic concoctions of linden blossom and raspberry. For coughs, expectorants from coltsfoot and plantain. In cities, herbalists often kept shops where they sold dried herbs, tinctures, and ointments. Unlike village healers, they were often literate and even kept records of recipes. Some compiled detailed herbals, illustrated guides for collecting and using medicinal plants, which became family heirlooms. However, alongside effective methods, there were practices based on superstitions. Some herbs had to be collected only on certain days of the lunar calendar, others, while uttering special incantations. It was believed that plants gathered at dawn on Ivan Kupala Day possessed special power. Healers believed that illness could be transferred to an animal or tree through special rituals. Particularly dangerous were attempts to treat serious infections by applying compresses of rotten meat, which only exacerbated the infection. Some healers applied spiderwebs to wounds, which sometimes helped stop bleeding, but often caused suppuration. A popular remedy for many ailments was considered to be fly agaric tincture, a deadly, dangerous preparation if incorrectly dosed. The attitude of official medicine and the church towards folk healers was ambivalent. On the one hand, their knowledge was recognized as useful. On the other, it aroused suspicion, especially if the treatment was accompanied by incantations and rituals. In the late Middle Ages, with the onset of witch punishments, many healers found themselves under threat of accusation of witchcraft. Nevertheless, it was these people, acting by trial and error, who laid the foundation for phytotherapy. Monastic herbalists actively adopted folk experience, systematized it, and supplemented it with knowledge from ancient sources. Thus, the practical wisdom of village healers gradually integrated into a more formal medical tradition. In the shadow of majestic monastic walls of medieval Europe, medicine was born that would later change the world. While university doctors pondered celestial spheres and barbers wielded their instruments, monks created the first healthcare system based on observation and compassion. Monasteries became true islands of knowledge in a sea of superstition. It was here that priceless ancient medical treatises were preserved. Monk scribes meticulously copied the works of Hippocrates, Galen, and Dioscorides, accompanying them with their own commentaries. In the scriptoria of Benedictine abbeys, illustrated manuscripts were created with detailed descriptions of diseases and their treatment methods. In the monasteries of St. Gall in Switzerland and Monte Cassino in Italy, the first hospital wards, infirmaries, appeared in medieval Europe. Here, not only monk brothers were treated, but also pilgrims, the poor, and travelers. Caring for the sick was considered a sacred duty, for in every suffering person, the monks saw Christ himself. Monastic medicine was characterized by a systematic approach astonishing for its time. Monks kept detailed records of disease symptoms, applied medicines, and their effectiveness. Thus, a base of practical knowledge accumulated, passed down from generation to generation. Unlike university doctors, monk healers did not shy away from physical contact with the sick and carefully observed changes in their condition. The heart of monastic medicine was the apothecary garden, Hortus Medicus. Hundreds of medicinal plants were grown here, many of which were brought from distant lands. Monks experimented with various methods of cultivating herbs, studied the optimal time for harvesting, and storage methods. In monastic laboratories, complex medicinal compounds were created, elixirs, ointments, powders. A special contribution to the development of monastic medicine was made by Abbess Hildegard of Bingen, who lived in the 12th century. Her works Physica and Causae et Curae contained descriptions of hundreds of medicinal plants and minerals. Hildegard was one of the first to link a person's mental state with physical health and developed a holistic approach to treatment. A crucial achievement of monastic medicine was the understanding of the importance of hygiene. While in cities, waste was poured directly into the streets, monasteries had well-designed water supply and sewage systems. Monks regularly washed their hands before preparing medicines and caring for the sick, changed bedding, and aired out rooms. These simple measures significantly reduced mortality. The Order of Hospitallers, founded in the 11th century in Jerusalem, established a network of hospitals throughout Europe and the Middle East. Their hospitals were incredibly organized for their time. Patients were placed one per bed, a rare luxury, received regular food, and each patient had a monk attendant assigned to them. Monastic medicine did not reject the spiritual component of healing, but complemented prayers with practical actions. This balance between faith and a rational approach laid the foundations of modern medical ethics, where caring for the patient's soul is as important as treating the body. In the Middle Ages, faith was not merely a spiritual practice. It became the last hope for those whom neither learned physicians nor barber surgeons could cure. Pilgrimage to holy sites transformed into a special form of medicine, where miracles were expected with the same certainty as the effect of a mixture or herbal decoction. Thousands of suffering individuals moved along the roads of Europe. The lame, the blind, the paralyzed, all sought to touch holy relics or drink water from a healing spring. Particularly popular were the relics of Saint Martin in Tours, Saint Fiacre, considered the patron saint of those suffering from hemorrhoids, and of course, the tomb of the Apostle James in Santiago de Compostela. The Church carefully monitored cases of miraculous healings. Every reported miracle underwent strict scrutiny. Special commissions of priests and sometimes doctors interviewed witnesses, studied medical histories, and verified whether the person had indeed been ill before the pilgrimage. Many cases were dismissed as unreliable, but some were recognized as genuine miracles. At the Abbey of Cluny, records of hundreds of healings were kept. Among them was the story of Jean from Dijon, paralyzed after falling from a horse. Doctors deemed his case hopeless, but after 3 days of prayer at the relics of St. Hugh, he was able to stand up. Or the case of the blind girl Maria, who regained her sight after her eyes were washed with water from a holy spring. Modern science offers several explanations for such healings. First and foremost, the psychosomatic effect. Deep faith activates the body's internal resources, causing the release of endorphins, natural painkillers. Many illnesses, especially those related to the nervous system, can indeed recede under the influence of strong emotions and conviction in recovery. Another explanation is the natural course of the illness. Many ailments resolve on their own, and the coincidence of recovery with a pilgrimage was perceived as a miracle. Furthermore, some holy springs actually contained minerals with medicinal properties, and a long walk to the shrine became a form of physiotherapy. The Church used miraculous healings not only to strengthen faith, but also to control medical practices. By deeming some treatments godly and others witchcraft, clerics shaped public opinion about permissible methods of healing. This was particularly evident in the attitude towards female healers. If a folk healer used herbs with prayers to saints, her activities might receive the blessing of the local priest. But the same herbs with incantations addressed to the forces of nature could lead her to the stake. Interestingly, some monastic infirmaries skillfully combined practical medicine with belief in miraculous healing. Patients were given medicine, provided care and hygiene, but at the same time, prayers and religious rites were encouraged. Such a comprehensive approach often led to recovery, which was attributed to divine intervention. In every market square of a medieval town, one could find them: merchants of miracles and sellers of hope. Charlatans, clad in bright attire with loud voices and convincing speeches, offered a cure for all ailments with one universal panacea. Their theatrical performances attracted crowds. An assistant would feign illness, drink the miraculous elixir, and instantly be cured before the astonished public. A special category consisted of relic peddlers, fragments of the true cross, milk of the Virgin Mary, or fingers of saints. In reality, these holy objects were manufactured in clandestine workshops. A splinter of ordinary wood transformed into a piece of the Lord's cross, and animal bone became the relics of a holy martyr. The Church tried to combat this phenomenon, but demand created supply. Pilgrims yearned to bring home material proof of their journey to holy places. Itinerant healers moved from village to village, never staying long in one place. This allowed them to avoid encounters with disappointed patients and the consequences of their treatment. They offered universal panaceas, elixirs of youth, powders for all diseases, amulets against the plague. The composition of such remedies was often harmless. Tinted water, crushed herbs without medicinal properties, but sometimes included dangerous substances, mercury, arsenic, or belladonna. The psychological tactics of charlatans were surprisingly sophisticated. They masterfully used the placebo effect long before its scientific discovery. The more expensive and exotic the remedy appeared, the more the patient believed in its effectiveness. Colorful bottles, mysterious inscriptions, complex rituals for taking medicine, all this enhanced suggestion. Charlatans knew how to diagnose diseases in a way that symptoms sounded frightening but sufficiently vague. You have corruption of the blood or displacement of internal organs. Especially cynical was the practice of charming away toothache. The charlatan would whisper magic words over the aching tooth, simultaneously and discreetly rubbing a pain-relieving ointment with clove extract into the gum. When the pain temporarily receded, the patient paid in gold for the miraculous cure, unaware that in a few hours the torment would return with renewed vigor. The most terrible harm from the activities of charlatans lay not in useless remedies, but in lost time. Patients who spent their last money on fake medicines delayed visiting real healers. By the time the deception was revealed, the disease had often progressed too far. City authorities periodically attempted to regulate the activities of healers. In some cities, special licenses were introduced, permitting the practice of medicine. However, corruption and the lack of unified standards allowed charlatans to easily circumvent these obstacles. Moreover, the line between quackery and official medicine of that era was very blurred. Even university doctors prescribed powder from crushed precious stones or amulets against the evil eye. Folk wisdom developed some ways to recognize deceivers. If a healer promises to cure everything, he will cure nothing, a medieval proverb stated. Experienced people knew, a true healer never guarantees complete recovery and honestly admits the limits of their abilities. But despair and fear of illness often made people forget caution. The Black Death, which enveloped Europe in the 14th century, became not only the greatest tragedy, but also a turning point in the history of medicine. When the first ships with sick sailors docked in Mediterranean ports, no one could have imagined that a third of the continent's population would perish within a few years. Doctors were powerless against the invisible enemy, and traditional treatments yielded no results. It was at this moment of despair that the first systematic approaches to combating epidemics were born, laying the foundations of public health. The Venetian Republic was the first to introduce the concept of quarantine, from the Italian 40 giorni, 40 days. Ships arriving from infected ports had to remain at anchor for the prescribed period before the crew was allowed to disembark. Special lazarettos were built on small islands in the lagoon, where the sick and those suspected of infection were isolated. This practice quickly spread to other port cities of the Mediterranean. Florence went even further, establishing the first sanitary council, a magistracy of health, in 1348. Its duties included tracking cases of illness, organizing burials of the deceased, and monitoring compliance with quarantine measures. Council members were granted unprecedented powers. They could close entire neighborhoods, prohibit mass gatherings, even church services, and fine violators. For the first time in medieval Europe, public health became a matter of state importance. City authorities realized that epidemics did not recognize social boundaries. Disease from poor neighborhoods inevitably penetrated wealthy homes. This led to the emergence of the position of city physician, a doctor who received a salary from the city treasury and was obliged to treat all residents, including the indigent. In Milan, for example, each district had one such physician who had to inspect his area daily, identifying the sick. To combat the plague, doctors invented special protective clothing. The famous plague doctor mask with a long beak filled with aromatic herbs, a long cloak, gloves, and a staff for examining patients. This costume became the first prototype of protective medical attire. Although it could not protect against the true cause of the disease, bacteria carried by fleas, it still reduced the risk of direct contact with the sick. At the height of the epidemic, authorities in many cities began to keep mortality records. The first statistical observations in medicine appeared. City scribes meticulously recorded the number of deceased by parish, their age, gender, and social status. This data allowed them to track the spread of the disease and take measures to localize it. Particularly thorough statistics were maintained in Milan, where these measures significantly reduced mortality during repeated outbreaks of the plague. Epidemics also forced a re-evaluation of urban sanitation issues. While previously waste was poured directly into the streets, many cities now began to build closed sewage systems. The first public baths appeared, mandatory for the poor to attend. Authorities issued decrees on regular cleaning of streets and squares and forbade keeping livestock within the city limits. In some Italian cities, special sanitary inspectors even appeared, overseeing the cleanliness of markets and butcher shops. The church, traditionally caring for the sick through monastic infirmaries, now had to share this responsibility with city authorities. In many cities, municipal hospitals appeared, funded by the city treasury and managed by secular individuals. This was an important step towards the secularization of medicine. However, monasteries continued to play an important role, especially in rural areas where secular medical care was unavailable. The most surprising legacy of this tragic period was the change in public consciousness. Health ceased to be perceived solely as a personal matter or a question of divine providence. Gradually, an understanding emerged that disease prevention is a collective responsibility, requiring the organized efforts of all society. Thus, from the greatest catastrophe of the Middle Ages, the concept of public health was born, becoming one of the foundations of modern medicine. In the shadow of medieval prohibitions and dogmas, a new era of medicine was born. The human body, considered a sacred vessel of the soul, long remained forbidden territory for scientific inquiry. The Church strictly condemned the dissection of the deceased, viewing it as a desecration of God's temple. However, the thirst for knowledge proved stronger than the fear of punishment. In the 13th century, in the Italian city of Bologna, an event occurred that changed the course of medical history. The first public anatomical dissection, performed by the physician Mondino de Luzzi. This was an act of incredible bravery. Mondino risked not only his reputation, but also his life. His work became the first practical guide based on real observations rather than on retellings of ancient authors. However, even he did not dare to completely reject the authority of Galen, explaining discrepancies between his observations and ancient texts as, in the 14th century, the first anatomical theaters appeared in Padua and Venice. Special rooms with circular seating for spectators around a central dissection table. Here, medical students could observe the work of the professor, who demonstrated the structure of the human body. dissections were performed in winter to slow decomposition and often turned into multi-day public spectacles, attended not only by doctors but also by townspeople, including noble ladies. Bodies for research were obtained in various ways. Officially, universities received the bodies of executed criminals. The statutes of many cities mandated the transfer of bodies of foreigners who died without relatives for anatomical research. However, demand exceeded supply, which gave rise to the grim profession of, quote, people who secretly exhumed fresh burials and sold the corpses to anatomists. In some cases, this led to actual crimes, murders for the purpose of selling bodies for research. The Church gradually softened its stance. In 1368, Pope Boniface VIII issued a bull permitting the dissection of bodies for medical and judicial purposes under certain conditions. This was an important step towards the legitimization of anatomical research. Nevertheless, many doctors continued to work in secret, fearing not only ecclesiastical condemnation but also popular anger. Ordinary people often saw anatomists as desecrators of graves. The real breakthrough came thanks to Renaissance artists. Leonardo da Vinci, striving to accurately depict the human body, performed dozens of secret dissections. His anatomical drawings, combining scientific accuracy with artistic skill, became an invaluable source of knowledge for doctors. The collaboration between artists and anatomists led to the creation of the first accurate anatomical atlases, where the structure of the body was depicted with unprecedented detail. To preserve bodies for long-term study, anatomists developed special methods. Solutions of salt, alcohol, arsenic, and various balms were used. Some techniques were borrowed from mummification masters or from Eastern traditions of body preservation. In particularly valuable cases, organs were boiled and dried, then coated with wax to create durable anatomical preparations. Andreas Vesalius, a 16th-century Flemish physician, brought about a true revolution by publishing his work. Having performed hundreds of dissections, he systematically refuted over 200 of Galen's errors, proving that the ancient physician often based his conclusions on the dissections of animals, not humans. Vesalius's book, illustrated with stunning engravings, became the first truly scientific anatomical work. Anatomical research led to crucial discoveries. Miguel Servetus described the pulmonary circulation, for which he paid with his life, being burned as a heretic. William Harvey proved that blood circulates in a closed system, refuting the millennium-old misconception that it is constantly formed in the liver and consumed by tissues. Marcello Malpighi, using a microscope, discovered capillaries connecting arteries to veins. Each of these discoveries began with a simple desire to look inside the human body, overcoming fear and prejudice. While Christian Europe slowly emerged from the darkness of ignorance, a brilliant Islamic civilization flourished in the East. In the great cities of the Muslim world, Baghdad, Damascus, Cordoba, knowledge was valued as the greatest treasure. It was here that ancient medical wisdom was not only preserved, but also further developed, enriched by the original discoveries of Arab scholars. When the flame of knowledge barely flickered in European monasteries, the House of Wisdom in Baghdad buzzed with work translating and commenting on the works of Hippocrates, Galen, and other Greek authors. These invaluable texts lost in Europe were saved thanks to Arab translators. But Arab scholars did not limit themselves to simply copying ancient knowledge. They critically reinterpreted the legacy of antiquity, tested theories with practice, and supplemented them with their own observations. Ibn Sina, known in Europe as Avicenna, created the monumental work The Canon of Medicine, a true medical encyclopedia covering all aspects of diagnosis and treatment. This 5-volume work contained descriptions of hundreds of diseases, thousands of medicinal remedies, and detailed recommendations for their use. Unlike European doctors, Avicenna attached great importance to patient observation and careful study of symptoms. He was the first to describe the contagiousness of tuberculosis, distinguish pleurisy from pneumonia, and propose using the pulse as a diagnostic tool. Arab surgeons were far ahead of their European counterparts. Al-Zahrawi, who worked in Muslim Spain in the 10th century, compiled an illustrated guide to surgery describing over 200 instruments, many of which he invented himself. He was the first to use catgut for internal sutures, developed techniques for removing bladder stones, and performing eye operations. The level of ophthalmology in the Islamic world is particularly striking. Hunayn ibn Ishaq created a detailed atlas of the eye, describing its anatomy with unprecedented precision. Ammar ibn Ali al-Mawsili invented a hollow needle for cataract removal by suction, a technique far ahead of its time. While European apothecaries knew only a few dozen medicinal plants, Arab pharmacologists worked with hundreds of plant, animal, and mineral components. They perfected methods of distillation, filtration, and extraction, creating pure medicinal forms. It was the Arabs who introduced syrups, elixirs, and alcohol-based tinctures into practice. The word alcohol comes from the Arabic al-kul, a fine powder obtained by sublimation. How did this advanced knowledge penetrate Christian Europe? Key roles were played by border zones of cultural contact: Sicily, reconquered by the Normans from the Arabs, and Toledo in Spain, which returned to Christian rule in 1085. In Toledo, a famous school of translators was established where Christians, Muslims, and Jews worked together. Here the works of Avicenna, Averroes, and Albucasis were first translated into Latin and then disseminated throughout Europe. The translation process was incredibly complex. Often the text was first translated orally from Arabic into a colloquial Romance language, and then written down in Latin. Many Arabic medical terms had no Latin equivalents, so translators had to create new words or adapt Arabic ones. Thus, terms like alcohol, elixir, syrup, camphor, and many others entered European medicine. European universities, which emerged in the 12th and 13th centuries, eagerly absorbed this new knowledge. In Salerno, Montpellier, Bologna, the works of Arab physicians became an obligatory part of the curriculum. Avicenna's canon was used as the primary medical textbook in European universities until the 17th century. However, this process was not a simple borrowing. European scholars adapted Arab knowledge, aligning it with a Christian worldview. Some aspects of Islamic medicine, especially those related to astrology or alchemy, aroused the suspicion of the Church. Texts were often censored or edited. It is noteworthy that the names of Arab authors were Latinized. Ibn Sina became Avicenna. Ibn Rushd became Averroes, which helped to Christianize their legacy. Despite these complexities, the influence of Arab medicine on European medicine was enormous. Methods of diagnosis by pulse and urine, surgical techniques, pharmaceutical preparations, all of this came from the East. Even the very idea of a hospital as a special institution for treating the sick was borrowed from the Muslim world, where such institutions existed long before their appearance in Europe. In a world where medicine was predominantly a male pursuit, there existed a parallel universe of female healing, inconspicuous, yet vital for medieval society. Female healers possessed unique knowledge passed down from generation to generation, from mother to daughter, from mentor to apprentice. Their art encompassed areas where male doctors had little experience or avoided altogether: obstetrics, women's diseases, infant care. In every village, there was a midwife, a woman who assisted during childbirth and knew the secrets of a successful delivery. Her hands welcomed new life. Her voice soothed women in labor. Her wisdom saved mothers and children in the most critical moments. Midwives used herbal decoctions to alleviate labor pains, new techniques for proper fetal positioning in the womb, and could stop bleeding with special compresses. Remarkably, many methods of medieval midwives are finding scientific validation today. Raspberry infusions, which they gave to strengthen the uterus, indeed contain substances that stimulate contractions. Shepherd's purse, used for bleeding, has a proven hemostatic effect. Even the positions that midwives recommended to ease childbirth are now returning to modern obstetrics as more natural and effective. Female herbalists specialized in treating women's ailments, from menstrual irregularities to infertility. They created complex herbal mixtures, taking into account the individual characteristics of each patient. Their arsenal included plants with hormone-like effects: sage, oregano, mint, sweet clover. Modern research confirms that many of these herbs indeed contain phytoestrogens and other biologically active substances that influence the female reproductive system. A special category consisted of women who specialized in infant care. They knew how to cope with colic, thrush, skin rashes, and other common childhood problems. Their methods were surprisingly effective: dill water for colic, chamomile decoction for bathing irritated skin, honey with sage for thrush. The position of female healers in medieval society was highly contradictory. On the one hand, their services were vitally necessary. Even noble ladies preferred to call a midwife rather than a university doctor when it came to childbirth or intimate diseases. On the other hand, they were always under suspicion. Their knowledge was considered dangerous and their methods questionable. The Church regarded female healers with particular wariness. In 1486, the infamous treatise Malleus Maleficarum, Hammer of Witches, was published, explicitly stating that midwives were especially prone to witchcraft. They were accused of using magical incantations, conspiring with evil forces, and even infanticide. Women who assisted with miscarriages or knew ways to prevent unwanted pregnancies aroused particular suspicion. With the beginning of the witch hunt in the 15th century, the position of female healers became truly dangerous. Many of them ended up at the stake. A neighbor's denunciation or an unsuccessful outcome of treatment was enough to accuse a midwife of witchcraft. Historians note that among the victims of the Inquisition, there was a disproportionately high number of women involved in healing. But even in these dark times, knowledge was not lost. Women continued to secretly pass on their experience, writing down recipes in household books, teaching daughters and granddaughters. Many of their methods later entered official medicine, although the authorship was lost or attributed to male doctors who systematized folk knowledge. The tragedy of medieval healers lay in the fact that their practical experience, accumulated over generations, often surpassed the theoretical knowledge of university doctors, but did not receive recognition due to their gender and social status. Only in our time are medical historians beginning to restore justice, recognizing the enormous contribution of these nameless women to the development of obstetrics, gynecology, and pediatrics. In the shadows of monastic laboratories and secret workshops of the Middle Ages, a science was born that some considered diabolical, others divine. Alchemy, the enigmatic art of transformation. The search for the philosopher's stone and the elixir of immortality became the unexpected cradle of modern pharmacology. Alchemists, these medieval experimenters, strived not only to turn lead into gold, but also to create medicines capable of curing incurable diseases and prolonging life. Paracelsus, a 16th-century Swiss physician and alchemist, brought about a true revolution in medicine, proclaiming, "This phrase became the foundational principle of pharmacology." Rejecting traditional Galenic medicine, Paracelsus turned to chemical substances as medicines. He was the first to use mercury for treating syphilis, antimony for infections, and iron for anemia, in precisely measured doses, transforming deadly poisons into healing remedies. Alchemical laboratories, with their alembics, athanors, and crucibles, became the prototypes of modern pharmaceutical production. It was the alchemists who perfected the distillation process, invented earlier by Arab scholars. They created alcoholic tinctures of medicinal plants, which retained their properties much longer than aqueous decoctions. They developed methods for extracting active substances from plants using various solvents. They learned to obtain mineral acids, alkalis, and salts of high purity. A special place in alchemical pharmacology was occupied by the search for the, quote, "the fifth essence," extracted from a plant or mineral and containing its healing power in concentrated form. Modern pharmacologists recognize in this endeavor the prototype for isolating pure active substances from natural raw materials, a principle underlying the creation of most modern medicines. In search of the elixir of immortality, alchemists created many preparations, some of which indeed possessed medicinal properties. Paracelsus's golden elixir contained gold chloride, which in small doses had a tonic effect. Potable gold, a colloidal solution of gold, was used for heart ailments. Modern science confirms gold compounds are indeed effective in some diseases, including rheumatoid arthritis. Particularly interesting were alchemical sympathetic powders and weapon salves, remedies for treating wounds from a distance. According to alchemical theory, if a medicine was applied to the weapon that inflicted the wound or to a bandage soaked with the wounded person's blood, healing would occur faster. Surprisingly, these remedies often contained substances with antiseptic properties: copper sulfate, arsenic, corrosive sublimate. Perhaps wounds truly healed better simply because the hands of medieval surgeons, with their questionable hygiene, did not touch them. Alchemists developed a complex system of symbols and cryptography to conceal their discoveries from the uninitiated. This created an aura of mystery around their activities, but simultaneously hindered the transmission of knowledge. Many recipes have come down to us in the form of enigmatic allegories, the deciphering of which requires a deep understanding of alchemical symbolism. Thus, could mean the dissolution of gold in aqua regia and, quote, 7, the combination of sulfur and mercury. The distinction between an alchemist and a charlatan in the Middle Ages was not always obvious. Many seekers of the philosopher's stone were sincere scientists, striving to understand nature through experiment. Others were clever deceivers, profiting from people's hunger for gold and immortality. However, even charlatans sometimes made useful discoveries, for a convincing trick required genuine mastery in manipulating substances. In monastic laboratories, alchemy took a special form. Here it was combined with traditional herbalism and prayer practices. Monk alchemists saw in their experiments not only practical benefit, but also a spiritual path, a way of comprehending the divine mysteries of creation through the study of nature. Their works often included not only chemical recipes, but also prayers that were to be recited at different stages of preparing the medicine. A battlefield is a special place where death and suffering go hand in hand with breakthroughs in medicine. It was on the battlefields of the Middle Ages that innovations were born, saving thousands of lives and subsequently entering peaceful practice. Military surgeons, these fearless masters who worked under whistling arrows and roaring cannons, became true pioneers of emergency medicine. Wounds from cold weapons, swords, spears, arrows, required a special approach. Experienced military surgeons knew the main danger was not the injury itself, but bleeding and subsequent infection. In field conditions, when every minute counted, they developed effective methods of stopping blood. Tourniquets made of leather straps, cauterizing vessels with hot iron, tamponating wounds with a sponge or moss soaked in vinegar. These techniques saved countless lives. Ambroise Paré, a 16th-century French surgeon, revolutionized the treatment of gunshot wounds. Before him, it was believed that gunpowder poisoned tissues, and wounds should be doused with boiling oil. One day, when the oil ran out, Paré was forced to use a simple ointment of egg yolk, rose oil, and turpentine. To his surprise, soldiers treated with this mixture recovered faster and with less suffering. "I dressed them, God healed them," he modestly said of his discovery. Amputation became a sad necessity on the battlefield. Shattered limbs, gangrene, irremovable shrapnel, all required radical measures. Military surgeons achieved astonishing mastery in this grim procedure. The best of them could remove a limb in a matter of seconds. Speed was critically important in an era before effective anesthesia. They developed special techniques for forming stumps, which later allowed for the use of primitive prostheses. Various means were used to control pain, from simple alcohol to complex opiate drugs. Some surgeons used a mixture of mandragora, belladonna, and opium, which plunged the patient into a deep sleep. Others resorted to physical methods, strong pressure on nerve trunks, or temporary tourniquet application to a limb to stop circulation, which reduced sensitivity. The military surgeons' instruments were constantly improving. Instrument sets made by famous masters, with razor-sharp blades and durable handles, were particularly valuable. Trepans for trepanation of the skull, forceps for extracting bullets and shrapnel, saws for amputations, needles for suturing tissues. Each instrument had its specific purpose and required special skill. Surprisingly, some military surgeons intuitively understood the importance of cleanliness. They boiled instruments in wine or vinegar, washed wounds with strong alcohol solutions, and used clean linen bandages. These measures, undertaken long before the discovery of microbes, significantly reduced the risk of infections. The organization of medical care on the battlefield also evolved. If in the early Middle Ages the wounded were simply dragged to the rear and given aid after the battle, by the 15th century the first field hospitals appeared. Tents set up near the battle site where surgeons could work in relatively calm conditions. Queen Isabella of Castile, during the Siege of Granada in 1491, created the first mobile military hospital in Europe. 6 large tents with beds, surgical tables, and a pharmacy. This innovation significantly increased the survival rate of the wounded, allowing aid to be provided in the first hours after injury, a critical period determining the chances of recovery. Many military surgeons kept detailed records of their observations and methods. These practical guides, based on real experience rather than theoretical reasoning, became invaluable textbooks for future generations. For example, Hans von Gersdorff's treatise Feldbuch der Wundarztni, Field Book of Wound Surgery, contained detailed illustrations of surgical procedures and became a true encyclopedia of military medicine. Interestingly, the status of military surgeons was higher than that of their civilian counterparts. If in peaceful life, surgery was considered a craft unworthy of an educated person. In war, surgeons enjoyed respect and privileges. They were valued by kings and commanders who understood that a skilled surgeon could maintain the fighting capacity of an army better than reinforcements. At the twilight of the Middle Ages, when dogmas gave way to observations, medicine began its long journey from art to science. In the shadow of Gothic cathedrals and in the squares of university towns, people emerged whose inquisitive minds were no longer satisfied with blind quoting of ancient authorities. They dared to doubt, observe, and experiment, laying the foundations of what would later be called scientific medicine. In the 14th century, the Italian physician Mondino de Luzzi performed an act unthinkable for his predecessors. He began systematically conducting dissections of human bodies. His anatomical theater in Bologna gathered students eager to see with their own eyes what they had previously only been able to read about. Although Mondino still relied on Galen, he already noted discrepancies between what was observed and what was described in ancient texts. Around the same time in Montpellier, the physician Guy de Chauliac created his Great Surgery, a work based not only on ancient sources but also on his own extensive experience. He was the first to describe the technique of trepanation of the skull using specially designed instruments, and proposed new methods for treating fractures and dislocations. A special place among the pioneers of new medicine is occupied by John Ardern, an English surgeon who worked at the court of King Edward III. His treatise on the treatment of anal fistulas, a condition considered incurable, was revolutionary. Ardern not only developed an effective operation, but also described each stage in detail, supplementing the text with illustrations of instruments of his own design. Unlike university professors who retold Avicenna and Galen, these practitioners created new knowledge based on personal experience. They kept detailed records of their observations, noting successes and failures, and analyzing the causes of complications. This is how the clinical approach, the foundation of modern medicine, was born. Remarkably, some of these physicians dared to openly criticize ancient authorities. Antonio Benivieni of Florence, in his work On the Hidden Causes of Diseases, wrote, "I have seen with my own eyes what contradicts the words of Galen." He performed autopsies on deceased patients to determine the cause of death, thus becoming the founder of pathological anatomy. In the 15th century, medical treatises began to be written in national languages, not just Latin. This made knowledge accessible to barber surgeons and apothecaries who did not have a university education but possessed valuable practical experience. Hieronymus Brunschwig, a Strasbourg surgeon, created the first printed manual on surgery in German, richly illustrated with engravings showing various operations and instruments. The invention of printing truly revolutionized the dissemination of medical knowledge. While handwritten treatises were accessible only to a select few, printed books could reach the hands of any practicing physician. Accurate anatomical illustrations, detailed descriptions of operations, systematic lists of medicinal plants. All of this could now be reproduced in hundreds of identical copies. During this period, the language of medicine itself also began to change. While previously diseases were described through the prism of the four humors theory as an excess of phlegm or excitation of yellow bile, now doctors increasingly spoke of specific symptoms, observed changes in organs, and the effectiveness of certain interventions. Medicine became more concrete and less speculative. Gradually, a new medical ethic was formed. While a medieval physician might refuse hopeless cases for fear of damaging their reputation, the new medics considered it their duty to fight for the patient's life until the very end. Ambroise Paré, a 16th-century French surgeon, formulated the principle that became the basis of medical deontology. I dress their wounds, God heals them. Looking back at the long journey of medieval medicine, we see a remarkable continuity of knowledge that has stretched through the centuries to our present day. Modern pharmacology, surgery, and medical ethics all trace their origins back to those distant times when doctors combined prayers with remedies, and monks carefully cultivated medicinal herbs in monastic gardens. Many plants used by medieval herbalists are now returning to medicine after thorough scientific research. Foxglove, from which digitalis is derived for storing heart failure, was used by Benedictine monks as early as the 12th century. Belladonna, from which atropine is now extracted, was used by medieval ophthalmologists to dilate pupils during operations. Willow bark, containing salicylates, precursors to aspirin, was known as an antipyretic since the time of Hippocrates. The surgical instruments used by doctors today bear a striking resemblance to those depicted in medieval medical treatises: clamps, forceps, scalpels. Their forms, refined by centuries of practice, proved so perfect that modern medicine has only added new materials and technologies to them. Even the surgical suture, invented by Ambroise Paré in the 16th century, is still used with minimal changes today. The principles of quarantine, developed by the Venetians to combat the plague, formed the basis of modern anti-epidemic measures. Isolation of the sick, monitoring of their contacts, sanitary control at borders, all of this was first applied in medieval Italian city-states. When the world faced influenza pandemics in the 20th century, and then new viral diseases, these ancient methods once again proved their effectiveness. The monastic tradition of caring for the sick transformed into the modern concept of nursing. Patience, attention to the patient's needs, meticulous execution of medical prescriptions. These qualities, for which the hospitaller monks were famed, became the foundation of professional ethics for nurses. It is no coincidence that the first secular nursing schools were established at monastic hospitals, adopting their centuries-old experience. Even in the field of medical ethics, we owe much to the Middle Ages. The oath taken by graduates of the Salerno Medical School contained principles remarkably consonant with the modern code of medical ethics: to do no harm, to preserve medical confidentiality, not to refuse aid to those in need regardless of their status or condition. These principles, having passed through centuries, are reflected in the World Medical Association's Declaration of Geneva. Medieval alchemists, striving to find the philosopher's stone and the elixir of immortality, laid the foundations for the chemical synthesis of medicines. Their methods of extraction, distillation, and crystallization are still used in the pharmaceutical industry today. Paracelsus, who proclaimed the principle that, quote, anticipated the main law of modern pharmacology, the dependence of effect on dosage. Interestingly, some medieval methods, rejected by official medicine during the era of scientific rationalism, are now experiencing a rebirth. Leeches, widely used for bloodletting, have returned to modern surgery as a means of improving microcirculation during tissue transplantation. Honey, with which monastic healers treated wounds, is recognized as an effective antiseptic, especially in cases of antibiotic-resistant infections. Even the medieval belief in the healing power of prayer finds confirmation in modern psychosomatic research. Scientists acknowledge that a positive attitude, deep faith in recovery, and spiritual practices activate the body's internal reserves, strengthen immunity, and promote the production of endorphins. What medieval monks called divine healing, modern science explains through the interaction of psyche and physiological processes. However, The legacy of medieval medicine is not limited to specific methods and preparations. Its most important contribution was the formation of the very approach to healing, a combination of empirical knowledge with compassion for the patient. In the era of high technologies and evidence-based medicine, this humanistic aspect acquires special value, reminding us that behind diagnoses and procedures always stands a human being with their suffering and hope. A critical reevaluation of medieval experience allows us to avoid two extremes: blind adherence to traditions and an equally blind rejection of them. The history of medicine teaches us that true progress is only possible where respect for accumulated knowledge is combined with a willingness to test it and discard misconceptions. This dialectic of old and new, experience and experiment, faith and reason remains the driving force of medical science in the 21st century.